So, Zoltan, thank you very much for your time. So, obviously, you stood to be a transhumanist candidate in the 2016 presidential election. How much do you think the kind of public attitudes to transhumanism have changed since then?
Well, to be honest, I was very lucky that the public received a transhumanist candidate in 2016 in a very real way. I mean, at some point we trafficked either fifth or sixth, kind of at the very end of all the candidates that finished the election. So we really got a lot, hundreds of millions of views. So at least they were interested, that we could say that for sure. Now, whether it was received well is another question, and whether it's made the movement grow. Well, it's definitely made the movement grow. But, social movements are set up sort of like you first hear about it and often you're skeptical. Yeah. Then you kind of grow to the idea like, oh, this is the future, probably the future. Then you sort of start to maybe fight it a little bit and way, well, do I want this future? And then you usually accept it because you're like, well, this is the future. So transhumanism is in one of those stages, early stages, and we're trying to spread the movement. And yeah, it's grown a lot since 2016. There's no question about it, especially in terms of venture funding going into the life extension industry and other people pushing forth ideas like that. Is it, our goal is sort of to make transhumanism as large as the environmental movement. We see the environmental movement on sort of a similar trajectory. 20 years ago, nobody was talking about cutting down trees, and now environmentalism is a multi-billion person movement. Well, we hope transhumanism over a 10 or 20-year timeline follows sort of a similar social trajectory where pretty soon billions of people say, well, yeah, I subscribe to transhumanism, or I don't mind some upgrades in my body. Right now, I think most people would say probably no to upgrades. But that's going to change. That's changing every year.
Because you've had an upgrade yourself, haven't you? You had, was it something inserted in your hand?
Yeah, I have a tiny chip in my hand. It opens front doors. It sends out a text message. You can do all sorts of things. You can start a car with it if you have the right software and stuff. So, I mean, and there are now thousands of people around the world with these kinds of implants.
I mean, do you think that transhumanism as a movement is growing globally, or is it kind of concentrated in certain Western countries?
No, I definitely think it's growing globally. There's no question that transhumanism is on a large growth curve at the moment. The real question, though, is how does it form? Again, going back to kind of the environmental movement, it was started sort of by Greenpeace, which had a lot of activism. And then all of a sudden it grew into this idea where governments were saying, well, let's take care of our own country better. Let's not poison our rivers. Well, transhumanism is in sort of this similar stage where it grew a lot because there's this fascination with science fiction, of course. We've all grew up on it. Netflix has all these films, whatnot. And all of a sudden people are saying, well, this technology is here. This technology is here. Google is doing that. And then the question is, well, when would you cut off your arm and put on a robotic arm? Let's say it's good enough in 5 years. Are you willing to do it in 5 years when that technology arrives? And most people say no. I say yes. But maybe in 10 years, you're like, well, my neighbor got it, and he's got a better job than me now because he works construction. He can lift more weight. So all of a sudden, it's kind of necessity, maybe is the demand of why transhumanism could really grow. We're in an interesting phase where a lot of transhumanist technologies are only being applied to a very small portion of the population, often disabled people or war veterans or things like that. But we're coming to an era like my chip implant where all of a sudden there will be a bunch of recreational and elective things that one can do to become transhuman. And the question is, when do you start to do that? I'm actually, involved in trying to push some kind of legislation through about the implants and things like that. We're starting to get that snowball effect where all of a sudden a lot of this stuff will become much more mainstream. But unfortunately right now, while the movement is growing, it's not something that you're like, oh, are you transhuman yet? We're not quite there yet.
Sure. Do you think it's best for transhumanists to kind of work through the existing political system, as in like the established parties, so join the Republicans or Democrats, Labour or the Tories, or have their own parties and their own separate political machinery? Which do you think would be most effective?
Well, so I'm probably going to run in 2020 again. Okay. I haven't made that final decision yet, and I'll probably wait another month or two before making it. And I can tell you that I'm going to join one of the major parties. Unfortunately, the Transhumanist Party is great, which I founded, and it's making important waves in the world, but America is set up such that there's really only two political parties. Even the Libertarian Party, which I ran for the governorship in California, has been around almost 50 years and has never really won a major seat in any of the 1,000 positions in American government.
Yeah.
And it's been around 50 years. So really, it's a duopoly, and you have to work within that duopoly if you want to make change. That said, I'm really happy I did start the Transhumanist Party, because it has become this kind of media machine which people actually will go to and say, well, what's the newest legislative ideas on this and this and this from a technological point of view or a scientific method point of view? Because we like to use the scientific method as a way to determine laws. And that's very unique thinking. And so people at least use the Transhumanist Party as kind of a bouncing board for their own ideas. And I'm sure the Republicans and the Democrats, I mean, I talked to one of Trump's state campaign managers a few weeks ago when I was in Ireland speaking. And he's like, oh, we knew exactly who you were. We know your policies. And I had this feeling that they were considering some of them as, maybe there is, a pick and choose, take a few percent from this group and apply it to our own. And I think that's really what the Transhumanist Party is good for, is we bring out ideas to the public, and hopefully other politicians who are in office will take it and maybe run with it and say, that's a good idea. Let's incorporate it into our own philosophies.
So it's basically about putting ideas on the political agenda, which were kind of previously quite left field.
Absolutely. Up until I think 2016, we really didn't have what we call a scientific agenda from a political point of view. Yes, we had policymakers for the Democrats and the Republicans, but we didn't have someone specifically saying, no, we don't side left, we don't side right, we're not even center. We simply make decisions based on the scientific method and on pure logic and reason. And how can we apply technological and scientific advancements in the political realm best? And that's really where the Transhumanist Party comes in. It really doesn't believe in ideological, political, have an agenda at all for that. It really is just, how can we push science and technology into the American public as fast as possible? And of course, now there are 20 different, parties around America. UK has a Transhumanist Party and all that. 20 different parties around the world that are transhumanist, or they have other different names, but we're all sort of in that same bucket, trying to use science and technology as the means to push forward political aims. It's a very different animal. We don't consider normal things like, yes, we have ideas on taxes, and yes, we have ideas on other basic things, but really we focus on the understanding that there's going to be huge technological change in the future. How can we best guide that from a political point of view?
What do you think the most important changes that a transhumanist government would be? So if you kind of choose policies for the government to implement, what would those be?
Well, I think the biggest one that's probably going to make the mainstream news first is the idea that we support a basic income, a universal basic income. And we support that because we know that AI, robots, automation, they're coming for jobs. They're coming for all our jobs. There's discrepancies on exactly how long it'll take, but a lot of people now believe that within 20 years, tens of millions of jobs in every single country will be wiped out, if not much more. And I'm a firm believer. I live in Silicon Valley area, and, hey, I see these companies, what they're doing. They're doing incredible things with robots. I'm not going to be able to outrun or outmaneuver or be more agile than a robot here in probably 5 or 7 years. So, that's a dilemma that every human worker faces. So we support a universal basic income, and we've been supporting that since 2016 as really the very first party that embraced it in its I suppose, bylaws and things like that.
That's really interesting because obviously, universal basic income does seem to be becoming far more mainstream. So obviously, I think it's Andrew Yang, is running part of his platform for Democrats. In the UK, the Corbynites are very keen on it, so the kind of the left of the Labour Party. So it's really interesting, as you say, how kind of like a fringe idea is moving itself to the mainstream. And that being the case, what do you think will be the next kind of fringe idea which will start to filter into the mainstream?
Well, I think for me, really, one of the things, and if I was to run in 2020, I'm going to be focusing on a couple key issues. And I think one of them really is going to be the idea that we're entering a genetic editing boom where China has already now children that have been modified on the genetic editing level, in the womb. we really have a generation of children that are going to be coming from these new types of technologies. I know there's some moratoriums out there right now on them, and there's controversy, but that could work itself out in 4 or 5 months, and pretty soon everybody could be going through this cycle in the next 2 or 3 years, having some of these upgrades. And again, we're talking, because it affects every single person on the planet with offspring, we're potentially talking multi-trillion-dollar industries. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden we really start to go and tackle things like hereditary disease in the womb, and we go and try to make people much stronger. And that is going to require a lot of policy. With growing inequality, I think we have a lot of issues with that already. How do you do that without raising taxes and still offering services to the poor? And it can only the rich afford it. So in my opinion, a lot of policy has to be put out on that. And this is not policy like, you have to go to a better school or a worse school. This is policy like clean drinking water. It's genetic editing is potentially going to need some type of backing of universal rights where everybody has access to it. Because if we don't all do this together very quickly, then we'll have subspecies and greater species and godlike people. And if you think inequality is bad now, just wait till your neighbor has an IQ that's 3 times yours, and is 8 feet tall. And these are things that require policies, yet they're so controversial. You'll never hear Trump or Hillary Clinton or anyone talk about it, because as soon as they talk about it, everyone's like, so I want to still continue to run on transhumanist themes and bring out transhumanist ideas that really hit the mainstream. Now, I'm obviously not going to win now. Maybe in 20 years I might. The goal is you lose 10 times and you finally win at the end.
Yeah.
But the idea is, if you keep talking about these things, one day these ideas will be right here, front and center, facing every single person. And of course, I'll be, honored to be the person who's been talking about it for 20 years. So those are the ideas that I would continue to run. And genetic editing is perhaps the most controversial and most deeply needed topic that we need policy on.
Now, I'm fascinated that you mentioned China, because obviously, the Chinese economy is booming. How much does it matter that the key technologies which transhumanists advocate are first perfected, if you like, in a democratic society or an authoritarian society like China? Could that kind of be one of the big ideological divergences of the next 20, 30 years, is who managed to exploit this technology best?
Well, first off, it's hard to say how authoritarian China really is. There's a lot of media reporting that's going on saying that they are, and yet from what I hear also from companies that are dealing with them, there's a lot of capitalism and kind of almost behind the scenes underground mafia stuff, which then almost becomes purely libertarian. Yeah. So you have this authoritarian kind of overtop with this kind of libertarian underpinnings at the bottom, as people do a lot of underhanded deals. That can make for fantastic commerce. I'm not saying that that's good system. I'm just saying that can make for a fantastic system of economy that can literally blow away America's quite strongly regulated system, where there's no, bending against the law. It really just follows the law. And, I think that's part of what the trade regulations are about. We're trying to kind of hone down on the copyright things and stuff like that against China, with, this trade war that Trump has, is because they are acting with rules that are not nearly as strict as ours. If you want to put a drug through the pipeline in China and get it approved, it takes half the time that it takes in America. Yeah. So why, if you were developing a kind of a new drug for cancer, let's say, would you want to push it through in America, push it through in China, and it's save 5 years of research? A lot of these companies aren't necessarily worrying so much about whether their drugs always work. That's why America worries. But China's just it's kind of the Wild West, and the Wild West can be very profitable. I'm not sure we can really compete against them. I'll just be honest, from someone who's watched it. And, again, this is what a lot of my, potential campaigns would be about, is that if America and democracy wants to survive, we need to figure out a way to take over China. I was just reading some very interesting statistics about American, Trump's really all up in arms. Hey, I created 3 million jobs. Hooray. China created 65 million in the last 5 years. It's not a comparable thing. we're going to be eaten alive by China. So we need to come up with a brand new system that takes them on and is able to compete. Otherwise, in 10 years, you're going to see a complete change in world police and all this other things and superpowers. And it may or may not be pretty. The only thing I can say is, since I'm a secular advocate, someone who's not really religious, there might be this underpinning that a secular environment in the modern 21st century can do better than a conservative environment. I mean, the reason we don't have genetic editing in America is because, our administration is all believing in God. We shouldn't modify the human being. Whereas the Chinese people are like, well, is this going to make us better? Then let's do it. And that type of thinking ultimately might actually have really, a strong engine for producing better economic results than our kind of, quite conservative American government.
So do you think there's a kind of small c conservatism in the West, which is, very much holding back all these developments and which could potentially see China kind of surge ahead of us, essentially?
Absolutely. I bang my fist on the conservatism of America all the time. Let's be honest, even with transhumanism in the life extension industry, all 535 members of U.S. Congress are, president, vice president, all 9 Supreme Court justices claim to believe in an afterlife, where transhumanism's main goal is to make it so that we don't die because we really don't believe in an afterlife.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we don't necessarily all believe, but, it's broadly a secular movement. Yet that's why we don't get any funding from the government when it comes to anti-aging therapies and this idea of life extension. The government is playing this role that they don't really care about, for them. They want to just make it so you can live better with cancer before you go meet God. Transhumanists are like, my God, we need a vaccine for cancer. There should be no cancer on planet Earth. It's the exact same thing with, the heart. A third of everybody will die from heart disease. That's just a fact. And but transhumanists are not interested in improving the heart. We're interested in replacing the heart with something bionic because we think the heart is a frail mechanism that's designed really only to last 60 or 70 years. And we want a titanium heart or whatever type of new synthetic heart we can create. And this just doesn't jibe well with a lot of conservative people who are willing to go through their life, have their children, and then die and meet their maker. And transhumanists are like, no, there's no maker. There's just dirt and worms eating our bodies at the end of our lives when we're dead. And it's sad. Everything of us is gone, except, maybe the children we left behind. And so we want to preserve that. We want to make it so we live 5,000 years, 10,000 years, however long we want to live. But it's very difficult because in an environment where, in America, medicine moves forward because of government funding. Government is by far the largest funder of medicine in the world, and research. And without that kind of funding, we don't get to go very far. And right now, there's almost no funding going to the anti-aging or life extension industry. And the only funding going into transhumanism is going into it from the military. And that's because we want to create super soldiers for more wars. Yeah. So, sure, we'll take the funding for that. But, it's to push transhumanism forward only through the military. That's not the kind of agenda or kind of world that I want to live in.
Do you think that religious social conservatism is going to be one of the biggest objections, one of the biggest problems for the transhumanist movement?
Of course. I can tell you right now that, there are all sorts of legislative things going on where people are coming out against microchipping. People are coming out against some of the new technologies. They're coming out saying, privacy is the one thing we must preserve. Therefore, we need to cap all these technology companies. And a lot of it makes quite a bit of sense on the surface. But then you think about it underneath, you're like, wow, the government's just trying to stifle innovation to protect what they consider the old world order. Yeah. In my opinion, and this is controversial a lot, I'm not the biggest advocate of privacy. I think transparency is actually what I really want in a real world. I'm not saying I want to be tracked into my bedroom, but at the same time, I think a lot of the transparency that has come from mass devices in our household, mass cameras and mass viewing of ourselves has made the world dramatically safer. There's facts to prove this stuff over. If there's a camera in a park, it's a dramatically safer place. I think people underestimate the whole issue of privacy. Sure, we don't want Facebook stealing our data or whatever, but in the end of the day, we all use Facebook voluntarily. If we don't like Facebook, just go do something else. So I think the government, though, is saying, oh, privacy is this built-in right, when really privacy is just a 150-year-old concept built from the bourgeois and whatnot. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. For many, many centuries, we were much more communal. There was very little privacy. And all of a sudden, privacy builds walls. But one of the main things I'm trying to get at here is that if we try to stifle companies from bringing out more functional features and more functional apps and things like this because of our old world order, we're going to do nothing except hurt our economy and hurt the level of innovation. What we really need to do is just give people free rein and let the consumer choose. And if they don't like a company because they're stealing their data or whatever, don't use that company. But to have the government step in, this is, they've always done this, and all they try to do is help establish monopolies and, stifle innovation. It's just not, it's not good.
Yeah. I mean, do you think the transhumanist revolution is probably inevitable? I presume that's what you think. But do you think it matters hugely whether it develops first in kind of democratic or authoritarian states? Do you think that have a huge impact on the future of humanity?
100%. I mean, it's so vital that transhumanism unfolds in an environment where democracy thrives. And the reason is because if it comes out in an authoritarian environment, it's very likely that those that are in power will keep the best technologies for themselves and never really give them out to the other people. I mean, we would go back to kind of serfs and fiefdoms and whatnot kind of situation. And I mean, we already are to some extent when you look at the disparity between, classes and people and the amount of money and the poor and the rich. So we need to, those of us who are kind of trying to be politicians or in policy, have to go out and ensure that the transhumanist world unfolds in a democratic way. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why, if I did run for office, I would be pushing very strongly democratic values, because I think as a society, we sort of need to kind of vote on this stuff. And the great thing we also need to do is let a lot of the free market decide these things. Yeah. The great thing about the free market is that it's every single consumer saying yes or no. And I know people say, oh, capitalism makes people poor and makes super people rich. That may be true, and maybe there are ways to moderate capitalism to make it a little bit more fair. But in the end of the day, it's done a lot better than communism. It's done a lot better than socialism, Venezuela. So a solid form of democracy is critical for making sure that everybody will have access to these radical technologies in the future. I can't say this enough. If we are not careful, we will wake up in 30 years and China will have babies that are 5 times smarter than the West. And that's what happens when some people hold back and some people move forward, and based on either authoritarian or democratic values. What we need to make sure is everybody says together, let's vote on this. This is good. Let's move forward. And I think everyone's going to inevitably invite the transhumanist future into their lives. It might be slower than I want, but it'll happen. And the reason it happens is because we all want to live longer. We all want to live better. We all want the best for our children. Transhumanism is not some kind of weird social movement. It's just this idea that we want better healthcare and better living standards in our life, and technology is the thing that can give it to us today.
So essentially, if liberal democratic countries don't keep up with the transhumanist revolution or kind of participate in it fully, they'll be handing authoritarian ideologies a huge competitive advantage.
Say that again, you broke up a little.
If liberal democratic countries don't kind of keep up with the transhumanist revolution and participate in the transhumanist revolution, they'll be handing authoritarian ideologies and regimes a huge competitive advantage.
Well, yes. And this is, this has been one of the big problems I've said again and again with, with my disagreements with Trump, is that by being too conservative, first off, the only way to make America great, let's just say that is your goal. I mean, it's a little bit of it sounds a little, but anyways, let's go on. Let's just say, okay, because I actually believe, and then everyone wants to make their country as good as possible. Sure. But you can't do that by stifling the one thing that made your country great in the first place. The fact that America had all these inventors, had Silicon Valley, innovation galore, and that's why we, airplanes and whatnot. That's what made America great. It was this idea that someone could come here and innovate and start a company and bring those ideas to the public and sell it. And now it's like, yes, we have someone who's obviously this king capitalist, at the top of the American, command. And yet what he's really good at is capitalism is understanding old school business. Yeah. Silicon Valley, that's why the major companies of the world are now the most valuable. They're here. They're technology companies. And that's going to continue. We're going to continue until the top 10 most valuable companies, top 100 most valuable companies are probably all technology. And you need to embrace that. I mean, I had Trump said the other day, I don't like cars that drive me. And I thought cars that drive you are statistically so dramatically safer than a person. And we need to just, get rid of our little shock or little worry of automation and robots and say, what do the statistics say? And the statistics say we're going to save tens of thousands of lives by having driverless cars on the road every year. And but an old school president can't understand that. We need somebody who's new. We need somebody who's fresh. We need somebody who's like, we can take on technology, make big, giant economic booms, and also make the world a far better place and more functional place to live. But, I mean, we have a president who probably doesn't email, who doesn't even know how to use it. I don't know. But these are, my 1-year-old daughter was using YouTube, at about 11 months. There's an entire new generation, and technology is changing perception and culture so much. We need people in command who are willing to take that technological innovation and really push it forward. When that person comes, whoever it may be, I think you're going to see huge changes very quickly, not only in the economic form, but also in culture. You're going to say all of a sudden a bunch of religious people say, well, we can still be religious, but maybe Jesus wants us to have all this technology too, and that's great. That's kind of the idea I'm now starting to advocate for, which is we're not trying to get rid of your religion, but you need to understand that modifications to yourself might have been God's plan all along. And, this is a different type of thinking in a country like America where 85% believe in Jesus.
Yeah. I was very interested that you mentioned, obviously, the possibility of having your neighbour next door having 3 times the intellect that you have. I mean, when the kind of transhumanist technology starts coming around and disparities in human intelligence could potentially increase dramatically, do you think the kind of democracy as we understand it can survive? I mean, will these new superhumans, super beings, be prepared to share power with kind of ordinary idiots like me who've currently unmodified?
Well, I try to be as honest as I can with you. It's not going to be pretty. No one's going to want to share power. Nobody ever does.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you share power when you have a little bit of it, but you get to the top, so much power. I mean, the nature of power is to protect it. That's the very first law of power is this protection of it once you gain it. So I think that's why I'm worried about once these people, the 1% sort of get transhumanist technologies in their hands, it's not like, we're going to continually share it so that economies boom around the world. I mean, maybe a lot of the new billionaires are doing a pretty good job right now of kind of sharing their wealth around whatnot, like Bill Gates, but it may not always be the case. We may not, the next billionaires may be much more like, let's say, Trump and his family rather than Bill Gates. And I don't see them sharing a ton with people. That's just not the nature of how some people operate. And if that happens, we are going to be in a dark place where the people don't have the power, they don't have the technologies, and the super people, the super transhumanist people are continually upgrading themselves until they become almost a different species.
Yeah.
And that's why I said it's critical we have policy that says everybody gets to stay and start from an open playing field. Even, and I hate to say this sort of as a libertarian-minded person, but even if it requires some kind of government grants or government mandates, we need to keep the playing field even, because very quickly we're going to see a dystopian society arise, and it could make, honestly, it could make slavery and things like that, be on that equivalent, a par of that. And that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about some people becoming so super powerful and making me their pet. And this is what a lot of transhumanists worry about. And we need to be very careful with that. And that's why I think governments need to be involved in the conversation now. They need to make sure that everyone has access to genetic editing. If there's any type of technologies going on, we need to be very careful. And then, of course, beyond that is this other idea that well, then there's AI. So now we're not just talking about superhuman people with power. We're talking about a superhuman intelligence maybe wanting to take power away from the superhumans and the poor people. Wow. I mean, this is we're entering a very complex 20-year period where a lot of new pieces of humanity are going to be figured out. And I mean, it's 50-50 whether humanity survives.
I mean, so do you see that, the future in kind of 50 years' time, do you think it's even going to be vastly better than the current situation or vastly worse? It's not going to be kind of like a little bit one way or the other?
No, I think it's going to be vastly better.
Okay.
I do believe in human beings. My friends dislike me for this. They say I'm an unrealistic optimist, but I do believe that, and statistics back me up. When you look at World Bank records and things like that, the world is getting better. There are less wars, less people are dying, more children are born healthy, more people are living longer, less poverty than there's ever been. We are growing in the right direction. It's very slow. For somebody like me who studies statistics and says, wow, we still have 7,000 or 8,000 children dying around the world from malnourishment and starvation every day, it doesn't look very good. But broadly speaking, the trend is in a positive way. And a lot of that comes from science and technology. A lot of that comes from vaccines and the widespreading of new innovations to people and just the ability to people have a pot and a pan and electricity and solar panels. And as long as that continues, we're going to improve the human race and everyone's living standard is going to improve at a better rate. And the rate's getting even better and better essentially every decade. The question, though, really is that kind of thing we just spoke about, which is at some point when the powerful get so powerful and then they have only access to technology themselves, do they take those upgrades? It almost sounds like a Harry Potter kind of scenario, but do they take the power and just run with it? And we're going to need some very strong caps in place. I've been seeing a number of politicians around the world. The Chinese president made himself president for life. These become more dangerous trends because all of a sudden you say, wow, this is no longer just, we voted on this person once. Now it's a dictator in power. Okay, I'm not saying he's a dictator, but there is this idea that presidency for life is something that doesn't really work in a democracy. We want term limits. We want fresh blood. We want people to get in there for their, 5, 8, 10 years, make changes as best they can, and then have new people go in. And that keeps the system alive and fresh without an authoritarian bent. So I worry that some of the things we've been seeing in politics, a lot of the right-wing conservative stuff is, or more authoritarian-leaning stuff, is dangerous for the world.
Yeah. I mean, this is slightly kind of curveball question, but do you think if we're a society, one society which is based on transhumanism, so where there's some individuals with hugely increased intellect and ability and so on, and kind of one country which for some reason bans it, so perhaps for religious reasons or just doesn't have the technology, is far more conservative, could you argue that the first country, even if it had an authoritarian regime, would have a huge competitive advantage over the second, just on the basis that its leadership would be far more intelligent and so on, regardless whether it's democratic or not? And the net result there's almost a kind of bias towards authoritarian states. In the it's kind of hard, and they would kind of have the advantage, if that makes sense.
Well, I'll be honest right now. There is a total advantage in China because of the authoritarianism. Yeah. And in fact, I'm a big believer I have always been a big believer in a benevolent dictatorship. Let's say you have a benevolent dictator who really is out there. And this is why I have said again and again that democracy is great, but the best thing that we should ever have is an AI that runs the world, that is programmed perfectly to really, truly do the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. There is no political system on earth that's better than a benevolent dictatorship. We hate the word dictator, but if a dictator is only serving the people all the time, he's truly benevolent, he or she is truly benevolent, or it is truly benevolent because it's a machine, that is the very best system that we could ever have. Because you would then have somebody, it's almost like a parent, just doing as much good for you as you can. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as benevolent dictatorships because nobody is benevolent and nobody is able to withstand power. This is why, though, I have talked before, though, it might be possible in the future to have an artificial intelligence through algorithms, and all those algorithms are designed 100% to deliver the greatest impact for the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. If that ever happens, sign me up. And I've said, before that as much as people may not like these ideas, this would be a transition that I would be willing to help government establish, because I think at some point, there's no question that humans are flawed. We've seen this again and again, that humans do bad things, leaders, not leaders, whatever. It would be so much easier to just have a perfect system set up that we could always say, well, statistically, it's doing the best for us. Now, those same concepts are one of the reasons why China probably has a head start in the transhumanist agenda than America, because America is slow, conservative. It wants to vote for these things, whereas China is probably just going to be like, if we can create super soldiers that allow us to have a military advantage, let us do it. And one person at the very top will say, well, I don't care if it's right or wrong. I just care about upholding the power.
Yeah.
Whereas, in America, even if Trump said that, he probably wants to say that, we're still going to have Congress. We're still going to have the Democrats. We're still going to have a lot of other people say, well, what's right? What's wrong? I've been to war. I don't want to be there. And then it has to go through the Supreme Court and all these other things. In the end of the day, the balance of powers will make it so that you can't push forward authoritarian tendencies, at least not very quickly. Whereas a place like China might just be able to slam that down the system and be there. And that's the advantage for them. And that's always been the advantage of a country that doesn't, one person can just, this is why they put generals in charge of wars, because sometimes they just need one person making the hard call and saying, troops are going to die, but we're going to win the war. And that can be very expedient for progress. It can be terrible for the soldiers.
Yeah. Do you think that, going forward, I guess at the moment, kind of one of the last century or so, one of the big divides has been between how do we distribute wealth in society, how do we distribute capital. Do you think that one of the big divides in kind of the next century is going to be how do we distribute technology? So in the same way, but currently there's the socialist capitalist divide is pretty crucial. Do you think that could be replaced by a kind of transhumanist, anti-transhumanist divide?
Forgive me, I'm a little sick. Let's see. This is I think ultimately speaking, what we have here is that if we the division and the distribution of resources in a transhumanist world has to sort of come through a government policy that says equality is the primary goal. I understand if you're competing against China, then maybe you have to say, well, we need to, on a national level, international level, be first and compete and, whatever. And sometimes maybe the smaller people have to take a hit. I understand that. But if the government is really out to distribute its resources properly, then it's going to have to come up with policies that literally mandate this. And I hate the word mandate, but if it doesn't, again, we just create it so there's going to, we have such a terrible homeless problem right now in San Francisco. It's just outrageous. I mean, I don't know if you heard about it, but we got hundreds of thousands of homeless now in California. I can't walk my daughter up to this beautiful City Hall building because there's feces, there's needles, they have HIV, whatnot, all over the ground. There's homeless people. You have to walk around. I mean, it's become like an epidemic. And if we create a society like that where there are billionaires walking amongst the homeless, because it's Silicon Valley after all, it just doesn't work. It feels bad. It doesn't justify why I think we're alive. We're also here to do good. We're also here to make something of our sisters and brothers, of our species. And that doesn't mean leaving all of them behind. I'm an individualist, but I have a point in my individualism, and that point is when I can't walk to City Hall because there are so many homeless. We need to find shelter for these people. We need to recover their lives. We need to do that, and that requires a certain type of sacrifice, and that sacrifice is okay for me.
Obviously, there are quite a few people who are absolutely amazed by potential transhumanism, very excited. There are also some people who I think are quite terrified about it. And as transhumanist technology starts kind of making progress and these things start actually happening, do you expect there to be more of a backlash against it? So to potentially kind of quite Luddite, very reactionary ideologies coming along, but to try and stop transhumanism, perhaps with a kind of religious bent. And do you think that could be kind of one of the big political divides in the next 50 years or so?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So I'm a big believer, and it's not 50. I mean, we'll be lucky if it's less than 10. I mean, not lucky, but, it will be less. We'll be lucky if it doesn't happen within the next 10 years, and it will happen within the next 10 years. Look, there's going to be an enormous conflict. And like I was saying, I was just involved in a bunch of, you can't even speak about them specifically, but there are a bunch of legislative cases right now going on about microchipping and whatnot in the United States that are setting up some of the very first legal battles. They're going to make their way to Congress. Same thing with driverless cars. I mean, it's not, transhumanism is not just this idea that, oh, let's merge with machines and, go off into the universe. It's this idea that we will fundamentally lose what it means to be a human being. Yes, we're going to keep our humanity, but there won't be biology anymore. And biology is something that was designed to disappear, like the dinosaurs. And this makes 85% of Americans crazy because they're like, no, Jesus made us who we are in the flesh. We are a temple of God. Do not modify it. Do not change it. The one thing that is punishable by eternal hell in the Bible is blasphemy. And what true transhumanists want to do? Well, they want to become godlike. Well, that's exactly what blasphemy is. So, yes, there will be a conflict. You see it all the time when Alex Jones bashes transhumanism. You see it all the time when right-wing Christians bash transhumanism. They're setting the situation that there will guarantee probably within 10 years be violent clashes. You will see demonstrations. You will see, perhaps some violence. I wouldn't want these things, but we're already seeing people dress up and lay themselves down in front of Google buses and make sure that the Google buses can't move as they're saying, take care of the environment and look at, you've replaced all the housing in San Francisco with your rich trillionaires, I mean, we're coming to a point when these clashes are going to spike. And overall, my book, The Transhumanist Wager, essentially tells a story because it talks about a story where a very right-wing president becomes, imagine, for example, if Mike Pence became president, the vice president. He is far more Christian. He doesn't want genetic editing. He doesn't care if we keep up with China. He's got real morals, and he's going to stick to those guns. And that is that would be not only detrimental for the economy compared to other people moving forward, but he would try to probably establish a lot of the legislation that would be anti-transhumanist against Silicon Valley. I mean, Google's not just a search engine anymore. Google's like, the Google brothers are interested in life extension. They're some of the biggest supporters of this stuff. These are people like myself that also don't want to die. So they're willing to spend their fortunes. And Mark Zuckerberg is interested in curing all disease. I mean, this is transhumanist. So these people are going to stand up and try to fight back. And it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be all over the media. I'm sure it's going to end up with some violence. I'm sure it's going to, I'm getting death threats still about once a week. And when I run for office, I get them like every day. But when will it kind of hit a peak where you kind of like talk, you see it on the news, you see fires burning and people hurt? Probably within a decade for sure.
Right. I mean, who do you get death threats from? Is that very conservative Christians or kind of like or religious reactionaries or?
Well, I get them across the entire spectrum now, but often they came from very religious people who really think that what I'm trying to do is harm the human being in order to become a cyborg. They think I'm under the influence of the devil, who is a very, the devil is the so-called very materialistic person. And, in the end of the day, transhumanists like myself want nothing like this. What we want to do is that the child across the street from me who died from leukemia, this happened sadly, we don't want that child to die. I have 2 children. I don't want them to die. I want to save them. And the way we save them is not through prayers and thoughts. The way we save them is through radical new science and radical technology by understanding biological systems and how to make them better, how to replace them. And that's how we keep people alive and make their living standards better. Again, I think if a lot of the religious people start to understand that, then maybe this conflict wouldn't happen. But I'm sure there has to be a conflict, and then the religious people will understand. I think ultimately the religious people will sign up for all these new technologies too. They just have to take it in the mindset that that the Bible can't be taken literally, and that blasphemy is not trying to become godlike. In fact, becoming godlike is maybe more like becoming like Jesus. Maybe technology can actually make us into really good human beings that are much more spiritual human beings, the kind that Jesus would have wanted. So, it's just, there's fundamentalism versus sensibility. And if we can find that sensibility, then we may not have these great this great kind of war, I would say. Almost, I don't want to say civil war, because it's not going to be like that, but it's going to be like the civil rights era, where there's going to be people attacked, and you're going to see marches and demonstrations. We've done demonstrations already. I mean, when George W. Bush stopped stem cell funding from the federal government for 7 years during his U.S. presidency, what was the real result of that? Well, the result was that hundreds of thousands of people suffered, and the technology and the scientists went abroad to continue their work. But the real result is that people died. People died because the United States president, for religious reasons, chose not to follow up on one of the most promising technologies in the world. And of course, now today it is one of the most promising technologies in the world. And we all use it for various different things. Unfortunately, George W. Bush, our president, stopped its funding, stopped it, essentially dead stopped in America for 7 years. This is incredibly sad for a leader of our country to do for religious reasons.
And one final question. I mean, in general, are you kind of optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the transhumanist movement?
Oh, say that again. I have to put you up a little more.
Are you optimistic about the future of the transhumanist movement?
I'm very optimistic about the future of the transhumanist movement. I know I try, maybe in this interview, I've given you a lot of the worries, and I've talked a lot about the political things, but ultimately, there's no question in my world that the world is getting better through radical science and radical technologies. And the more we use of it, the better we're going to get. One of the problems is a lot of people think like, oh, using Facebook is radical technology and Facebook drives everybody crazy. Okay, I'm the first to admit, yeah, social media does make people sort of crazy. At the same time, it's also been responsible for the Arab Springs and other things and democracy spreading and whatnot. But in the end of the day, don't think of technology in terms of social media. Think of it more in terms of the ability to communicate with your family when you're on the other side of the earth, the ability to do podcasts and let media talk to new people, the ability to just use technology functionally, that we can get on a plane and fly places. Overall, technology and science have dramatically improved our world in a myriad ways. It will continue to do that as long as we don't stifle it and as long as we don't treat it like this terrible, stepchild that always does things wrong. Technology and science are the reason that we have become this society that is so amazing, can do all these amazing things, knows every corner of the world, can visit every corner of the world. We need more of it, and we need more people to know about it. We need more people to embrace it. One of my great goals of the transhumanist movement is to stop having celebrities that are singers and football players or whatever, but to have celebrities that are scientists, celebrities that are technologists, celebrities that are engineers. This is the kind of society I want to live in, a scientific utopia where we really respect and love the people creating this innovation more than any other people out there. Our mentors and our hopes and dreams are tied to scientists and technologists.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.